As the 1950s dawned, the Cold War solidified into a permanent, frigid reality. The skies over Wright-Patterson were now filled with the shriek of pure American design, the sleek F-86 Sabre, the delta-winged F-102, the early prototypes of the Century Series fighters. In this new pantheon of technological confidence, the Junkers PP-1101 began to look less like a prized oracle and more like an embarrassing secret. Its very existence was a whispered contradiction to the narrative of unchallenged American aerospace supremacy. It was a relic, yes, but a dangerously eloquent one. To display it, even in a restricted museum for Air Force personnel, was to risk questions. Where did this come from? Who built it? How did they think of this? Its forward-swept wings were a silent accusation, a testament to a brilliant, malignant imagination that the victors were supposed to have utterly eclipsed. Thus, the P-1101 entered a twilight period of deliberate obscurity. It was shuffled around the vast Wright-Patterson complex like a ghost in a bureaucratic machine. A young airman, tasked with inventorying a hangar in 1952, would later recall seeing it tucked behind a disassembled B-36 fuselage, its distinctive shape shrouded in a greasy tarp, a layer of dust softening its lines. A civilian contractor in 1954, working on the heating system of a long, low warehouse known as Building 181, reported seeing it being wheeled in by a security-cleared team, its wings detached and resting on a separate dolly. He was told by an air police guard to forget what you saw, and the incident was noted in his security file for years after. Then, sometime after 1955, the paper trail, always sparse, simply stops. The meticulously created accession number, the classified property tags, the loan slips for wind tunnel testing all ceased to reference the aircraft. It was administratively disappeared. In the labyrinthine filing system of the Foreign Technology Division, it was as if the P-1101 had never existed. What happened to the physical airframe is one of the most enduring mysteries of Cold War aviation history. The theories are a spectrum of the plausible, the conspiratorial, and the poignant. The most mundane and likely explanation is silent bureaucratic destruction. In this scenario, a memo, never declassified, was signed by a mid-level officer in the Material Command, citing space requirements, lack of historical relevance, or the more blunt security sensitivity. It would have authorized the demilitarization and scrapping of the prototype. Under this order, a crew with cutting torches and sledgehammers, under the watch of a security officer, would have reduced the sleek fuselage to unrecognizable chunks of aluminum and steel in a secluded corner of the base scrapyard. The unique wooden wing spar would have been burned. The Heat's 0101 engine might have been saved for further study, stripped of its identifying marks. The pieces would have been melted down, their metal potentially recycled into something benign. Part of a runway extension, perhaps, or the frame of a new office building on base. This was the fate of countless other captured Axis aircraft, a practical and final solution to a problem of space and secrecy. A second theory posits a more purposeful exile. Proponents point to facilities like Area 51 at Groom Lake, Nevada, or the Lockheed Skunk Works in Burbank, California. In this version, the P-1101 wasn't destroyed, but preserved as a unique test article for thinking outside the box. Its radical configuration could have been used as a physical reference for stealth shaping studies in the 1960s, or for examining unconventional control surfaces. Perhaps it was shipped to one of these black sites, where it sat in a darkened hangar, studied occasionally by engineers working on the A-12 Oxcart or the F-117 Nighthawk, a fossil from an earlier technological epoch that still had lessons to teach. This theory appeals to the romantic idea that the machine was too valuable to destroy, its genius too pure to waste. The most haunting theory insists it still exists, that recognizing its ultimate historical significance, yet unable to acknowledge it, the Air Force chose to enter it. In this scenario, the disassembled aircraft was sealed in a custom-built wooden crate, perhaps coated in cosmoline preservative, and lowered into a sealed, concrete-lined bunker somewhere on the vast 8,000-acre Wright-Patterson complex. It would be buried, not in earth, but in bureaucracy. Its location known only to a vanishingly small number of people, the coordinates lost with a retirement or a death. It would rest there, a technological sleeper, awaiting a day when its origins were no longer a threat to national myth-making. This theory transforms the P-1101 into a true aviation archetype, a sleeping king under the mountain awaiting a call that never comes. No theory has ever been definitively proven. The official documents that remain are ghosts of themselves. Declassified reports on Operation Paperclip and foreign material acquisition contain curious gaps where the P-1101 should be mentioned. Pages are missing from logbooks. Photographs and archives are mysteriously absent, their place in numbered sequences empty, with captions that read, "Photo removed for security reasons." Even in documents released under the Freedom of Information Act, heavy black bars of redaction obscure serial numbers, dates, and location names. It is a void surrounded by ink, an absence meticulously maintained. The men who knew the truth have passed on, their secrets kept. The mountain in Bavaria still stands, its emptied bunker now a tourist curiosity. But the machine that once dwelt within it vanished into the American heartland, consumed by the very machine of secrecy it helped to inspire. Its final fate is the ultimate expression of its legacy. It became a classified subject, even in its own destruction.
Outside, under a moonless sky, a disguised Reichsbahn freight train, now commandeered by the U.S. Army Transportation Corps, waited on a spur line that served the hidden airfield. Loading the large, awkward crates onto the rail cars was a nerve-wracking ordeal conducted in near-total darkness, illuminated only by shrouded lanterns. The sound of each crate settling onto the wooden flat car seemed deafening in the silent forest. By the dawn of the third day, the mountain bunker was an empty, echoing shell. The railcar doors were sealed with official U.S. Army locks, and the train began a slow, cautious journey west, away from the advancing Soviet tide, its route meticulously planned to avoid major population centers and any possible interception. The paperwork created for this movement was a masterpiece of bureaucratic obscurity. The shipment was logged as Experimental Aeronautical Materials, Category B, Non-Urgent. The manifests listed generic items like airframe subassemblies and power plant components. The official after-action report filed by the 12th Armored Division made a single dismissive mention of minor experimental aviation material recovered from a dispersed production facility of limited tactical value. It was a deliberate lie, crafted to send any prying eyes, journalists, Allied officers, even curious congressmen, down a blind alley. Unofficially, the P-1101 and all its associated documentation vanished into a labyrinth of classification. Upon its arrival at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, it was immediately assigned a restricted Level 3 classification. This was not merely secret. This was a category reserved for the most sensitive projects, on par with the early research into atomic energy and radar-absorbent materials. Access lists were shorter than a general's golf foursome. The message from the top was unambiguous. The existence, let alone the details, of this German jet was not to be shared with anyone. Not with the British, who had been vital allies in the air war. Not with the French. Certainly not with the public. The American military establishment, which had just won a world war on the backbone of its own immense industrial and scientific might, found itself in a psychologically complex position. They possessed proof that, in a few narrow but spectacular fields, the defeated enemy had been on the verge of leapfrogging them. To admit this publicly would be to undermine the narrative of total Allied superiority. The P-1101 was not just a machine to be studied, it was a secret to be buried, its origins sanitized from the historical record before they could ever take root. Months later, in the echoing high bay expanse of Building 89 at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, the Junkers P-1101 was reborn in a new world. Reassembled under the watchful eyes of a select team from the Air Technical Service Command, it rested on its landing gear, a ghost from a lost war in the heart of the Ohio prairie. The ambient noise of the base, the shriek of other jet engines being tested, the distant shouts of drills was a stark contrast to the tomb-like silence of its Bavarian mountain. Ambient engineers in crisp khaki and flannel shirts circled it, their notepads filling with sketches and questions. Flight testing it, however, was immediately ruled out. The reasons were multifold and deeply pragmatic. The HES-011 engine, though advanced, was an unknown quantity with no support infrastructure. Spare parts were non-existent. The aircraft's control systems, hydraulics, and avionics were all engineered to German standards and tolerances, a labyrinth of metric fittings and unique components. Most critically, there was only one. A crash on takeoff, a catastrophic failure in flight, would obliterate this unique data source forever. The P-1101 was too precious to fly. It would become a museum piece, albeit one in a museum with a clearance level. So, they studied it. For years, it was subjected to the most intense technical dissection in aviation history. It was placed in wind tunnels, its forward-swept wings buffeted by artificial gales while sensors measured pressure distributions and predicted stability. Its structure was analyzed, the Rohrholz wooden spar poked, prodded, and eventually dissected to understand its remarkable strength-to-weight ratio. Every line of its fuselage was mapped, its profile compared to evolving American theories on area ruling for supersonic flight. The Germans had arrived at many of these concepts through a combination of brilliant intuition and desperate necessity. The Americans now had the luxury of methodically reverse engineering the why behind the what. And then something profound and inevitable happened. The silhouette of the German prototype began to bleed through the drawing boards of American designers. The knowledge gained wasn't merely copied, it was digested, refined, and Americanized. The most compelling feature, the variable sweep wing, was the one that captured the imagination of a brilliant, stubborn engineer at Bell Aircraft Corporation named Robert Woods. Woods had seen the P-1101 at Wright-Patterson and had been granted access to some of the classified German data on its pivot mechanism. He became obsessed with the idea, but with a crucial improvement. Why limit the adjustment to the ground? What if a pilot could change the wing sweep in flight, optimizing it in real time for every phase of a mission? This concept became the Bell X-5. Funded by the Air Force and NACA, the precursor to NASA, the X-5 was, in spirit and lineage, the direct offspring of the P-1101. It was smaller, powered by an Allison J-37 turbojet, and far from a combat aircraft. But at its heart was a mechanically complex, electrically driven system that could pivot its wings from 20 to 60 degrees of sweep during flight. First flown in 1951, the X-5 was a troublesome, tricky beast. Its center of gravity shifted dramatically as the wings swept back, making it inherently unstable. It killed one of its test pilots, the legendary Captain Ray Popson, in a spin from which recovery was impossible due to the aerodynamic changes of the swept wing. It was in many ways a dangerous dead end. But it proved the concept. It provided terabytes of data, in the language of the time, reams of telemetry paper on the practicalities of variable geometry wings. It demonstrated the tremendous performance benefits, the ability to loiter with straight wings for endurance, then sweep them for a supersonic dash. This data became the foundational gospel for a new generation of American warplanes. From the troubled lessons of the X-5 soared the General Dynamics F-111 Aardvark, a brutal, powerful swing-wing fighter bomber that could penetrate Soviet air defenses at treetop level and supersonic speeds. Its variable wings gave it the range to be a strategic asset and the speed to be a tactical weapon. The concept was then refined into the sublime Rockwell B-1 Lancer strategic bomber, a machine of awe-inspiring grace and lethality, whose wings sweep from a straight, low-drag position for maximum fuel efficiency to a sharply swept arrow for a high-speed, low-level penetration run. The ultimate expression, however, was born in the U.S. Navy's need for a fleet defense interceptor capable of protecting carrier groups from swarms of Soviet bombers. The Grumman F-14 Tomcat took the variable sweep wing and married it to a revolutionary radar and missile system. The Tomcat's wings would automatically sweep forward for the slow, controlled approach to a carrier deck and snap back for a supersonic sprint to intercept a threat hundreds of miles away. It became an icon, a symbol of American naval air power for 3 decades. The DNA of the P-1101, the idea of a single airframe morphing to meet conflicting demands, was woven into the very fabric of these legendary aircraft. Yet as these magnificent American birds took flight throughout the 1960s and 1970s, the origin of their most distinctive feature became a carefully guarded state secret. The Cold War was not just a conflict of armies, it was a battle of ideologies, a contest of systems. The narrative of American technological supremacy, of innate innovation and free market genius triumphing over the stifled, brutalized science of a totalitarian state was a central tenet of Western propaganda. To publicly acknowledge that one of the most transformative advances in post-war aviation, the swing wing, had its direct origins in a Nazi prototype hidden in an alpine mountain would have been politically catastrophic. It would have handed the Soviets a propaganda coup and raised uncomfortable questions at home about the nature of the knowledge harvested under paperclip.
The team's aerodynamicist, a young MIT graduate named Captain Paul F. Kress, ran his hands over the wing surface. The design was profoundly clever. Forward swept wings, he knew, had a theoretical advantage. At high angles of attack, the wing roots stalled before the tips, maintaining roll control and preventing the deadly, uncontrollable spin that plagued conventional swept-wing designs. But they also imposed enormous twisting forces on the structure, forces that would rip a conventional wing apart. Junkers engineers had solved this by using a revolutionary approach, Rohrholz. They had constructed the main wing spar, not from metal, but from laminated wood, incredibly strong and flexible, able to twist elastically under load. It was a breathtaking marriage of medieval material science and futuristic aerodynamics. Every detail whispered of speed. The air intakes on the forward fuselage were carefully shaped with a subtle internal compression ramp to slow and pressurize the incoming air for the turbojet, a primitive but effective form of what would later be called a supersonic inlet. The canopy was a single blown plexiglass bubble, flawlessly smooth. The control surfaces were minuscule, all-moving slab tailplanes, a design that provided greater authority in the turbulent, shockwave-ridden air near the speed of sound. The landing gear was tricycle style, retracting neatly into the fuselage, a configuration far more advanced than the tail draggers still common in 1945. But the most shocking discovery came as they inventoried the cavern. In a side chamber, carefully created and labeled, they found the engine, a brand new Heinkel HES-011 turbojet, the most powerful jet engine Germany ever produced in meaningful numbers. Next to it were crates containing the unfinished avionics suite, a rudimentary but functional radar-ranging gun sight, and banks of vacuum tubes for radio and navigation equipment. Stacked neatly on a pallet were the aircraft's intended armament, 4 potent 30mm Mk-108 cannons. This was not a mock-up. This was not a disassembled prototype. This was, as the team's report would starkly state, a flyable aircraft approximately 80% complete. The engine was ready to be installed, the guns to be mounted, the avionics to be wired. The war had ended before the final assembly and systems integration could be finished. And then there were the notes, meticulous, ink-on-paper engineer's logs, wind tunnel test results, and performance calculations. They were left behind. Perhaps in haste, perhaps in the hope that the knowledge would survive even if the Reich did not. Captain Kress, with his fluent technical German, pored over them late into the night, a single lamp illuminating columns of dense Fractal script and complex graphs. The numbers he found there caused his blood to run cold. The calculations for drag, lift, and control effectiveness were extrapolated far beyond the known performance envelope of any existing aircraft. They were modeling behavior in the transonic region, the dreaded sound barrier. The most telling document was a summary report from Dr. Anselm Franz, the brilliant engineer behind the Junkers jet programs.
In it, he discussed the P-1101 not merely as an interceptor, but as a Versuchsflug für Grenzgeschwindigkeiten, an experimental aircraft for boundary velocities. The stated goal, Kress translated with growing disbelief, was to achieve Überschallflug, supersonic flight. The notes implied not just hope, but expectation. The design, with its variable sweep wings, supersonic intakes, and reinforced structure, was a calculated assault on Mach 1. Sitting in that cold mountain cave, surrounded by the tangible evidence of a shattered regime, Paul Kress understood the profound historical pivot they were witnessing. The Bell X-1, a bullet with wings designed expressly to break the sound barrier, was still just a blueprint in a safe in Buffalo, New York. Chuck Yeager was a young combat pilot still flying Mustangs over Europe, unaware of the destiny that awaited him 2 years hence in the skies over Muroc Dry Lake. If the German jet engine program had not been crippled by bombings, material shortages, and political infighting, if this mountain facility had been completed just 6 months earlier, if a test pilot had been able to strap himself into that sleek cockpit, fire up that HES-011 engine, and point that needle nose at the sky over the Alps, then the first sonic boom to shake the earth might not have been an American one. The P-1101 had the potential to rewrite the opening chapter of the supersonic age, to snatch a monumental psychological and technical victory from the jaws of total military defeat. It was a haunting thought. In the deepest despair of its collapse, Nazi Germany had been on the cusp of leaping a generation ahead. Colonel Watson understood the magnitude immediately. He issued strict orders. The site was to be sealed. No one not directly involved with the Wizards was to be admitted. Every document, every tool, every component was to be cataloged and created. And the aircraft itself, the Junkers P-1101V1, was to be extracted from its mountain tomb with extreme care. It was not just a war prize. It was a time capsule from a future that had nearly happened, and America now held the key. But what they would do with this knowledge and this machine would become one of the most closely guarded and consequential secrets of the early Cold War. The race for the sound barrier had just found its starting line, and it began in a silent Bavarian forest in a darkness that had just given up one of its most profound secrets. The awe that filled the mountain bunker was quickly supplanted by a cold, strategic dread. Colonel Watson and his team stood in a silent conference around the P-1101, their flashlights creating pools of light in the gloom. The technical marvel before them was also a political and military time bomb. Intelligence briefings crackled over their field radio. Elements of the First Ukrainian Front were advancing rapidly from the east, consolidating their hold on Saxony and Thuringia, the traditional heart of the German aviation industry. They were perhaps only days, maybe a week from overrunning this very sector of Bavaria. The Red Army had its own version of Watson's Wizards. Teams of engineers and NKVD officers under the ruthless General Georgy Tokov, scouring the ruins of the Reich with one mandate: seize every piece of technology, every scientist, every blueprint. They were particularly hungry for advanced aircraft. The thought of this forward swept-wing Phantom, with its supersonic design notes being loaded onto a flat car and trundling east towards secret design bureaus near Moscow, was a nightmare scenario that made the American blood run cold. It could erase the hard-won aerial advantage of the Allies in a single stroke. The decision was instantaneous and came from the highest levels of the still-forming Pentagon. The P-1101 would not become a Soviet trophy. Its extraction was no longer a matter of technical curiosity. It was an urgent combat operation. It fell under the sprawling, shadowy umbrella of Operation Paperclip, the program to harvest German scientific minds and hardware before the Soviets could. But this was different from persuading a rocket scientist like Werner Braun to defect. This was a physical snatch and grab of a singular, irreplaceable artifact. What followed was a clandestine ballet of logistics and secrecy, executed under immense pressure. A special security detachment from the Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, arrived first, replacing the regular infantry guards. Their orders were absolute: shoot to kill any unauthorized personnel attempting to approach the site, be they curious locals, looters, or, especially, Soviet scouts. The mountain entrance was shrouded in additional camouflage netting, and a 24-hour perimeter was established with orders sealed under threat of court-martial. Then came the technicians, a hand-picked team from Wright Field's Foreign Technology Division. They worked in a frenetic, yet meticulously precise 72-hour marathon. Under the direction of a Junkers foreman they had located and persuaded to assist, they began the careful dissection of the aircraft. This was not a demolition job. It was a surgical procedure. Each component was photographed in situ before removal. Every cable, hydraulic line, and control rod was tagged with a numbered label that corresponded to a master diagram. Rivets were carefully drilled out, not torched. The revolutionary forward-swept wings with their laminated wood spar were detached from the complex pivot mechanism and swaddled in layers of felt and custom-built wooden crates lined with straw. The nearly complete HES-011 engine was created separately, a prize nearly as valuable as the airframe itself.
The Bavarian forest in April of 1945 was a place of ghosts and echoes. The snow had retreated, leaving a carpet of sodden pine needles and patches of stubborn, grimy ice. The air, crisp and cold, carried the distant, percussive thump of artillery to the east, the last dying convulsions of the Third Reich. But here, in the deep woods southeast of Oberammergau, beneath the shadow of the towering Alps, an unnatural quiet had settled. It was a silence too deep, too watchful. It was the silence of something hidden. Elements of the U.S. 12th Armored Division, the Hellcats, were pushing through this region, mopping up scattered resistance and securing territory. Their maps showed little of interest, logging trails, remote villages. But as a reconnaissance patrol moved through a clearing near the village of Miesbach, a sharp-eyed sergeant named Elias Thorn noticed something the cartographers had missed. Through a break in the towering firs, he saw not forest floor, but cracked concrete. They had stumbled upon the overgrown remains of an airfield. One so well concealed, it had likely escaped Allied photo reconnaissance. It was small, with a single short runway, its edges already being reclaimed by moss and grass. Hangars lay in splintered ruins, their corrugated steel roofs peeled back by some earlier precise bombing run. But it wasn't the destruction that caught their attention, it was an anomaly. At the far northern end of the field, where the forest rose sharply into a heavily wooded hillside, a wide, smooth ribbon of concrete, startlingly intact, shot straight from the runway and disappeared into the base of the hill. It was a ramp, like a driveway for giants, but it led nowhere, or so it seemed. The area was artfully littered with fallen trees, piles of brush, and draped with extensive rotting camouflage netting that mimicked the forest canopy. To a casual observer, it was just more wreckage. But Thorne, a former civil engineer from Ohio, saw the logic in the concrete. It was too deliberate, too purposefully laid, to simply end at a wall of earth. Calling his squad over, weapons at the ready, they approached. The air grew colder as they neared the hillside. Up close they could see it, a subtle seam in the terrain, a vertical line of newer masonry against the ancient rock. It was a door to the mountain itself, 15 meters tall, cunningly sculpted and painted to look like the surrounding cliff face. One of the massive steel doors, designed to slide open on recessed rails, was slightly open, wedged open perhaps by the concussion of a nearby bomb or by a frantic final exit. A dank metallic breath exhaled from the darkness within. Using crowbars from their vehicle, the men, muscles straining against the immense weight, managed to widen the gap just enough for a man to slip through. Switching on their heavy, Army-issue flashlights, the beams cut into a blackness so complete it seemed solid. The air inside was frigid, smelling of damp concrete, oil, ozone, and something else. The sharp, coppery scent of machine shop coolant and fresh paint. The sounds of the outside world, the wind in the pines, the distant war, vanished, swallowed by a tomb-like stillness. Their flashlight beams played over a cavern of staggering scale. This was no mere cave. It was a cathedral of industry carved into the heart of the mountain. Reinforced concrete arches soared overhead. Rusting gantry cranes hung from rails on the ceiling. Workbenches lined the walls, still littered with tools, as if the workers had just stepped away for a lunch that never ended. Blueprints and technical diagrams fluttering in the draft from the open door were pinned on boards. And in the center of this vast, subterranean hall, resting on its own fixed truss, was a machine that stopped the men in their tracks. It did not belong to 1945.
It did not belong to any war, they understood. Its fuselage was an elongated predatory dart, seamless and smooth, painted in a primer of dull gray. The cockpit, fared seamlessly into the nose, was a teardrop canopy that promised impossible visibility. But the wings defied comprehension. They swept forward. In an era defined by the straight wings of Mustangs and Spitfires, or the modest aft sweep of the new German Me-262 jet, this was a visual paradox. It looked wrong, like a bird with its bones broken backwards, yet it exuded a terrifying aerodynamic logic. The wings were thin, knife-like, mounted mid-fuselage. At the rear, the engine housing tapered to two exhaust nozzles that were not simple round pipes, but flattened rectangular apertures, their shapes utterly alien to the men staring at them. This was not a fighter in any conventional sense. It was not stout and rugged like a Thunderbolt. It was not a bomber. It had no bay, no payload. It was something else. A pure expression of speed, stripped of all compromise. A laboratory with wings. Sergeant Thorne approached cautiously, his boot heels echoing in the vast space. His flashlight beam traveled along the sleek flank until it caught a stenciled inscription near the cockpit, the black paint stark against the gray metal. It read, UP-1101, Versus Modell. Below it, a manufacturer's plate, Junkers Flugzeug und Motorenwerke AG, Dessau. He had never heard the designation. He radioed back to command, his voice a hushed static crackle in the mountain's belly. We found something. You need to send someone who knows about airplanes. And tell them it's like nothing we've ever seen. Word traveled up the chain with electric speed. Within 48 hours, the remote forest site was cordoned off. A specialized U.S. Army Air Force's Technical Intelligence Unit, known as the Watson's Wizards, was dispatched. This was a group of pilots, engineers, and intelligence officers whose sole mission was to find, capture, and evaluate advanced German aviation technology. They had been chasing ghosts, rumors of wonder weapons, sonic bombers, and rocket planes. Most leads evaporated into myth, but this was tangible. When the team lead, Colonel Harold H. Watson, himself a seasoned test pilot, stood in the cavern and let his own flashlight beam travel over the P-101, P-1101, he later confessed he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain's cold. It was the chill of glimpsing the future. Here, in this hidden Bavarian redoubt, shielded from the Allied bombing campaign that had pulverized Junkers' main facilities in Dessau, was the clearest, most advanced vision of that future he had ever encountered. A German jet prototype so advanced, it seemed to have fallen from another timeline. The initial assessment by Watson's team was conducted in a state of controlled awe. They worked under the glare of hastily rigged generator-powered lights, their breaths misting in the cold air, the silence broken only by the clicks of cameras and the murmur of technical discussion. They weren't just examining an aircraft. They were conducting an archaeological dig on a future that never arrived. The first revolutionary feature was the wing. Close inspection revealed it was not merely fixed in its radical forward-swept position. At the wing root, engineers discovered an intricate, heavily greased internal mechanism. Detailed schematics found on a nearby desk confirmed it. The entire wing assembly could pivot on a central spar. Using a ground-based hydraulic jack connected to a socket on the fuselage, the sweep angle of the wings could be mechanically adjusted between 35 and 45 degrees. The implications were staggering. Aircraft design is a brutal compromise. Straight wings provide good lift and stability at low speeds for takeoff and landing. Swept-back wings delay the onset of compressibility drag, allowing for higher, safer speeds as an aircraft approaches the sound barrier. But you had to choose one or the other, locking the aircraft into a performance envelope. The P-101's variable sweep mechanism promised the holy grail, optimal wings for every phase of flight. It was a design concept American engineers like Robert Jones at NACA were only just theorizing on paper. It wouldn't materialize in an American production aircraft until the F-14 Tomcat in the 1970s, nearly 25 years later. But here it was, in a Bavarian mountain, fully realized in steel and aluminum.